The first thing Klaus Richter noticed was that the sea was wrong. It was just after 5 in the morning on the Normandy coast. A thin, damp mist hung over the English Channel. It muffled sound. It blurred the horizon into a gray line. The air smelled of salt and wet earth. Another night watch. Another day of waiting for an invasion that never seemed to come. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment lifted his binoculars. At first, he saw nothing new, just the slow light of dawn trying to push back the dark. Then the horizon thickened. A dark smudge appeared where sea met sky. It grew, sharpened, multiplied. This was not the tide, not a storm front. The line of darkness stretched left and right until he could no longer see empty water at all. What he was looking at was not a fleet. It was a city of steel, a floating metropolis sailing out of the mist and straight into history. Long before the first Allied soldier stepped onto the sand of Omaha Beach, before the world even knew those names, Richter understood something. The Reich was about to drown. To understand the shock of that morning, you have to step inside the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the cliffs of Norway down to the Spanish border, German engineers had built the Atlantic Wall. On paper, it was a chain of concrete and steel, thousands of bunkers, gun batteries, minefields, and obstacles. In propaganda, it was more than that. It was proof that the Reich could seal the continent against any invasion. Proof that no army could cross the Channel and survive. Posters showed endless rows of bunkers. Newsreels showed proud crews manning huge coastal guns. But Klaus Richter was not a poster. He was a professional artillery officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front. At 32, he was old enough to remember a different Germany and young enough to have been shaped by the furnace of the war. He knew the difference between propaganda and reality. Richter commanded an artillery battery of the 352nd Infantry Division. His guns were solid Czech-made pieces, mounted in concrete casemates a few miles inland from the beaches the Allies would soon codename Omaha. From his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff. He had a commanding view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men drilled. They calculated firing solutions, maintained their guns, cleaned equipment that never fired in anger, and they stared out at the same empty gray water. The talk in the bunker was always about the invasion. Der Tag X, the day of days. When would it come? And more importantly, where? German intelligence was certain the main attack would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. It was the logical choice. That was where the 15th Army, the bulk of Germany's strength in the West, was waiting. Normandy was considered a sideshow, maybe the site of a diversion, but not the main event. This was a massive strategic miscalculation, and it was no accident. It was the result of a brilliant Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, which created a fake army opposite the Pas de Calais, complete with dummy tanks and false radio traffic. The effect was simple. When the real invasion came to Normandy, the German High Command refused to believe it. Richter's division, the 352nd, was better than many of the coastal units. It had a solid core of veterans from the Eastern Front, men like him. But much of its strength was made up of teenage conscripts and older reservists pulled back from quieter fronts. They were brave, they were dutiful, but they were not the elite stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders asked to hold a line that was stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself, the thing propaganda called impenetrable, was more patchwork than solid wall. Many bunkers were incomplete, minefields had gaps, the distances between strong points were so great that even powerful positions could be bypassed or isolated. Richter knew this. He had seen the shortcuts local farmers still use through supposedly sealed zones. He knew the blind spots in his fields of fire. Professionally, he was skeptical that the wall could stop a truly determined assault. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension along the coast became a living thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given responsibility for improving the defenses, had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines laid along likely landing sites. He had thousands of jagged steel obstacles hammered into the beaches. The men called these obstacles Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood a truth that many in Berlin seemed determined to ignore. If the Allies were not defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. With Allied air power dominating the sky, any German reinforcements moving toward the coast would be shredded on the roads. The first day was the only day that really mattered. But on June 5th, the weather turned. A storm blew in over the channel, high winds, rough seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently announced that an invasion was impossible for several days. Senior officers relaxed. Rommel himself left France to visit his family in Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm, they believed, would keep them safe. So, as Klaus Richter stood watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the mood in many headquarters was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected anything. Richter was looking east when he saw the flicker. He raised his Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart, slowed by hours of darkness and boredom, began to pound. It was not a flicker. It was ships, not a patrol, not a raiding party, hundreds of hulls, and behind them, more. He swept his binoculars left and right. Everywhere he looked, dark shapes crowded the water. The channel was no longer empty gray sea. It was a solid mass of metal, a presence so huge it felt like the horizon itself was moving. German intelligence had believed the Allies might assemble around 3,000 vessels for a full-scale invasion. Even that would have been monumental. What Richter was seeing was something else entirely. He tried to count. It was impossible. His brain did something different instead. It began to classify. He picked out the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. He saw swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like a wolf pack. And then he saw the others, the endless, low-lying landing craft of every shape and size, packed so tightly they looked like iron filings pulled toward a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The image did not change. It only grew clearer as the sun climbed. Later, the official figure for Operation Neptune would be given as nearly 7,000 vessels from 8 different nations. It remains the largest amphibious invasion fleet in history. For Klaus Richter, it was not a statistic. It was a physical force pressing on his chest, a declaration of industrial power so immense that it made everything he thought he knew about warfare feel suddenly obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had answered with a bridge of steel. Richter grabbed the field telephone. His hand was slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4, he shouted. "I have visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end sounded tired, almost bored. "We have reports of a few ships, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No," Richter's voice cracked. You don't understand. It is not a few ships. It is thousands. The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a pause. He could almost hear the man picturing him as a young officer spooked by shadows. "Oberleutnant," the voice replied, "sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show your report is incorrect." Richter slammed the phone down in frustration. It was too big to be believed. He tried another line and reached regimental headquarters. "Richter here, sir. The invasion fleet is in front of us. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment, it felt like an understatement. "Are you certain, Richter?" the major asked. The weather, Richter snapped, "is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." This time, the urgency cut through. What was happening along the Normandy coast that morning was more than a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of imagination. The German command structure was paralyzed because reality had outgrown their mental map of the war. While Richter watched the fleet, many senior officers were focused on reports of parachutists inland. They assumed the paratroopers were the main event. The fleet was dismissed as a diversion. No one in the higher headquarters was really looking at the sea. Klaus Richter did not wait for them. He shouted orders to his men. Startled from their routine, they rushed to the observation slits and gun positions. For a moment, they simply stared. They saw what he saw. The drills were over. This was real. Heavy shells were hauled up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that suddenly seemed impossibly large. The great barrels of the guns, silent for so long, elevated slowly until they pointed their steel noses toward the Armada. Richter pressed his binoculars to his eyes. He could see the first landing craft beginning to form up. He could feel a low vibration in the air, a hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to throw the first stone. The formal order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For Richter, it was like a knot untying in his chest. The paralysis of disbelief was replaced by the familiar clarity of action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground shook as the first gun fired, then a second, then a third. Shells screamed out over the water. Richter tracked their fall through his binoculars. Plumes of water erupted among the ships. A miss, then another. His men adjusted. New range, new bearing. For a brief window, the old craft of artillery seemed to matter again. He saw a plume of smoke rise from an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There was a flash of orange, dark smoke pouring from the hull. Some later accounts suggest the ship may also have struck a mine. From Richter's vantage point, his guns had drawn first blood as the destroyer listed and later sank beneath the waves. A ragged cheer went up from his battery. For a few minutes, it felt like a battle. Then the feeling died. After the Corey went down, the fleet did not scatter. It did not slow. The gap in the formation closed as other ships slid forward to take her place. The iron tide rolled on. Richter's guns fired again and again, but for every ship they might damage or harass, 100 more steamed past untouched. He felt futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. He looked beyond his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. Allied battleships, ships like the USS Texas, were now turning their massive 14-inch guns toward the shore. The reply began as a low rumble across the water. He saw tiny flashes on the distant ships, like a silent lightning storm. Seconds later, the air around him tore itself apart. The earth convulsed. Geysers of soil erupted from the fields around his positions. The industrial dismantling of the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the sky and saw only Allied planes, fighters, bombers, endless streams of transport aircraft. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for armored counterattacks to throw any invasion back into the sea. But the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was frozen by confusion and bureaucracy. Its commanders waited for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When the division finally moved, it did so under a sky thick with Allied fighter bombers. Columns of tanks and half-tracks were ripped apart long before they reached the coast. Standing in his shaking bunker, guns thundering around him, Klaus Richter realized something. This was not a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies were not trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to erase him. As the bombardment intensified, something shifted in his mind. The tactical part of his brain began to shut down. In its place came a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing individual ships and planes. He was seeing the system behind them. He looked at the Armada and imagined the factories that had built it. Through his trembling binoculars, he saw, in his mind's eye, the assembly lines of Detroit. Factories in the United States and Britain churning out trucks, engines, guns on a scale Germany could not match. The logistics of this invasion, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, was not a miracle. It was math, industrial output. He thought of the sky above him. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew perhaps 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies flew more than 14,000. For every German plane over Normandy, there were more than 40 Allied aircraft. The reason was not a lack of German courage. It was the factories. The same story was playing out with tanks. Richter knew the reputation of German panzers. The Tiger and Panther were feared machines, thick armor, powerful guns. Allied crews respected and dreaded them, but that technological edge came at a cost. They were complex, expensive, slow to build. For every Tiger tank that rolled off a German assembly line, the Allies produced dozens of simpler but brutally effective Sherman tanks. In 1944, the United States alone built over 17,000 tanks of all types. Germany's monthly tank production never consistently exceeded about 2,000 vehicles. The Allies were not trying to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality, the industrial equation of defeat. All the talk of willpower and ideological strength melted in the face of those numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a united, fanatical people could overcome so-called decadent democracies. But ideology could not stop a bomber. Willpower could not sink a battleship. Richter felt a deep, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die not because they had been outfought, but because they had been outproduced. They were participants in a contest that had already been decided. The entire German army in the West was like a finely crafted sword meeting a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome was never in doubt. He thought of the propaganda posters at home, the speeches about final victory. It was all a lie, not just a political lie, a mathematical one. The high command in Berlin must have seen the production charts. They knew how many planes, tanks, and ships the Allies could build. Yet they had sent him, and millions like him, into a war that could not be won. By the final year of the conflict, the strain of confronting this truth helped drive a rise in suicides among German officers at the front. They were not just fighting the soldiers of America, Britain, and Canada. They were fighting the full, unrestrained power of the modern industrial world. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became brutally real. The naval bombardment rose to a constant thunder. Concrete shook. Dust rained from the ceiling of Richter's bunker. Through the observation slit, he saw the first waves of landing craft touch the shore. Higgins' boats dropped their ramps. American soldiers poured into the surf, only to be cut down by machine guns from the German pillboxes overlooking Omaha Beach. From his high vantage point, Richter watched the horror unfold. Water turned red, bodies piled at the tide line. The 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a terrible price. For a while, it looked as if the defense might hold. The Americans were pinned down. Then the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter on the beach, did something both suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly toward the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, their hulls scraping sandbars. They turned their guns on the German bunkers, firing almost point-blank in support of the troops. At the same time, strange new machines appeared. Richter saw amphibious trucks, the DUKWs seemingly drive out of the ocean. He saw specialized tanks with huge rotating chains on their fronts, beating the ground to set off mines. These were Hobart's Funnies, British-designed engineering tanks built for the specific job of cracking coastal defenses. The Germans had nothing like them. What had looked like a chaotic struggle turned into a methodical process of annihilating each strong point in turn. On Omaha Beach alone, the 352nd Division may have suffered around 1,200 casualties that day. A staggering share of its fighting strength wiped out in hours. Richter's own battery soon drew the full attention of Allied guns. Shells landed closer and closer. One direct hit turned a gun pit into a fireball. Another position was smashed to rubble. Telephone lines went dead. Commands dissolved into the roar of explosions. Richter looked up at the sky. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. Out at sea, the first wave of landing craft was already being replaced by a second, then a third. Behind them, the vast Armada waited in disciplined rows, a conveyor belt of men and material that looked, from his bunker, like it could run forever. The Allies would land around 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beach still raged, but the outcome was decided. It was now only a question of time and tonnage. The war in Normandy would grind on for 2 more months. The fighting in the hedgerows would be brutal and costly, but in strategic terms, nothing had really changed after that first morning. Every German tank destroyed in Normandy was a loss that could not be replaced. Every Allied tank knocked out was replaced by several more. Every German soldier killed left a gap in the line that could not be filled. For Klaus Richter and the thousands of German soldiers who survived the first day, the rest of the war was an epilogue. They fought on, some driven by duty, some by fear, some by a patriotism that had drifted far from reality. But the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the dawn light of June 6th, 1944. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, grinding collapse ending in the ruins of Berlin. For the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came earlier. It came the moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky black with enemy planes, and a force that was not just an army, but the concentrated output of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of war, one that was not truly decided in trenches or bunkers, but on assembly lines thousands of miles away. For one German officer in a concrete bunker, peering through binoculars at a sea that had turned to steel, that June morning was the moment he knew the war was already lost. If you want more stories that show how ordinary soldiers experienced history's turning points, subscribe to Last Stand History and join us for the next episode, one last stand at a time.